The sun on that Sunday morning was the kind of bright that promised warmth but held onto the chill of the retreating night, a perfect mirror of the young man standing stiffly by the hitching post of the simple clapboard church. His name was Wyatt, and he was a cowboy, not by trade alone but by the very fiber of his being. The leather of his boots was worn soft around the ankles, and his hands, clasped tightly behind his back, were a roadmap of nicks and calluses earned from roping steer and mending fences. Today, however, he felt none of the steady confidence those hands usually carried. Today, his heart was a wild thing, a mustang kicking against the walls of his chest, for he had resolved to change the entire course of his life before the noon bell rang. Inside the church, the final hymn was a gentle hum that seeped through the wooden walls, and Wyatt used the sound to steady his breathing. He had spent the entire previous season not just driving cattle across the sprawling valley, but driving posts into the earth on a small, secluded plot he had bought with every saved-up dollar. With aching muscles and soaring hopes, he had raised a cabin there log by log. He had fitted the window frames himself, sanded the floorboards until they were smooth, and built a stone hearth large enough to heat the entire home. That empty cabin was a silent prayer, a physical offering of everything he was and everything he hoped to be. It was a house waiting for a heartbeat, and in his mind that heartbeat had a name: June. When the church doors swung open and the congregation spilled out into the sunlight, it was as if the world sharpened its focus for Wyatt. There she was, June, the daughter of the town baker. At 19, she carried the light of someone who saw the world as a collection of songs yet to be sung. Her dress was a simple calico, but on her, it seemed to shimmer. Her laughter, when it came, was a quick, bright sound that made folks smile without knowing why. Wyatt watched her, his throat going dry. He saw the way she looked past the town sometimes, her gaze fixed on the distant train tracks that vanished over the horizon, and he mistook that longing for a dream they could build on together. He waited, his hand clenched around the small velvet-wrapped ring in his pocket. He waited until she had finished talking with the pastor's wife, until she drifted toward the old oak tree that had shaded 100 years of church socials and quiet conversations. This was the moment. His boots made soft, crunching sounds on the gravel path, each step a drumbeat leading him to his future. June turned, a smile of friendly recognition on her face, a smile that did not yet know the weight of the question about to be asked. Wyatt did not mince words. He was a man of the land, and his speech was as straightforward as a furrowed field. He stood before her, the scent of pine and earth clinging to him, and he told her of his love. It was not a flowery speech, but each word was a sturdy brick laid with care. He spoke of the cabin, of the future he saw so clearly it was like a memory he was waiting to live. He painted a picture with his quiet voice of mornings watching the sun rise over their own land, of evenings by that large hearth, of a life built side by side. Then, his heart feeling as though it might leap right out of him, he lowered himself to one knee in the cool grass beneath the oak tree. The world seemed to hold its breath. The chattering of the other churchgoers faded into a distant murmur. Wyatt looked up at June, his hope shining plain in his eyes, and asked her to be his wife. For a terrifying second, there was only silence. The light in June's eyes, which he had taken for shared joy, flickered and changed. It was not happiness he saw now, but a kind of panicked fear, as if the walls of the very future he was describing were closing in on her. The picture he painted so lovingly felt to her like a cage, a small, predictable life in a small, predictable town. Tears, bright and sudden, welled in her eyes. "I can't, Wyatt," she whispered, the words sounding torn from her. She took a small step back, creating a chasm between them that felt miles wide. "When you talk like that, it feels like you already see every single inch of a life inside me as if I've never had a choice of my own." She spoke of the world beyond their valley, of cities she had only read about in tattered books, of music that was not hymns but the soaring notes of orchestras. She did not see his dream as a gift but as a demand. She was sorry, she said, so truly sorry, but she could not say yes. The rejection was not a simple no. It was a demolition. It was the sound of the logs of his cabin splintering, the windows shattering, the hearth going cold before a single fire was ever lit. The ring in his pocket, once a symbol of promise, now felt like a lead weight pulling him down into the earth. He rose slowly from his knee, his face a careful blank mask, the kind a man learns to wear when he is breaking on the inside. He nodded once, a short, sharp movement, unable to find any words that could possibly fit the ruin he felt. Without another look, he turned and walked away, his stride long and purposeful, heading not toward the home he built for her, but toward the stable where his horse was tied. The news, as it always does in a small town, traveled faster than a galloping horse. Wyatt could feel the pitying glances and the hushed whispers like physical touches. He could not bear it. Within a week, he had packed his saddlebags, secured a job on a long cattle drive heading west, and left the valley without a single look back. The dust from his horse's hooves was like a curtain falling on the first act of his life. He worked with a fierce, silent intensity under the vast, unforgiving sky, his body weary, his spirit adrift. His prayers, once quiet conversations of thanks, became silent, angry questions shouted into the wind. Why had he been given the dream of a home only to have its foundation ripped away? Meanwhile, June, armed with her savings and her father's reluctant blessing, boarded a train to the city. For the first few weeks, it was everything she had imagined. The buildings were towering giants of brick and stone, the streets were a river of people and carriages, and the music from the concert halls was indeed magnificent. But slowly the bright colors of the city began to gray. The music started to sound thin and lonely, echoing in her small rented room. The faces on the street were a sea of strangers, none of whom knew her name or cared to learn it. The freedom she had craved began to feel like a vast empty space, and in the quiet moments her mind would wander back to the steadfast look in Wyatt's eyes, the solid promise in his voice, the safety she had so carelessly thrown away. A year after she had left, a much quieter June returned to her father's bakery. The bright, restless girl was gone, replaced by a thoughtful young woman with a sadder, wiser light in her eyes. She kneaded dough in the early morning silence, the familiar yeasty smell a comfort that no city perfume could match. She began to attend church again, sitting in the family pew, her gaze often drifting to the old oak tree outside. The hollow space inside her, the one she had tried to fill with travel and new sights, remained. It was a June-shaped emptiness, a silence where a shared future should have been. She opened her Bible not out of habit, but out of a desperate need, praying for forgiveness for her hastiness and for guidance to find her way back to the solid path she had so foolishly abandoned. She had gone searching for a grand song, only to realize she had left the only melody that ever truly mattered behind. The seasons turned over the valley with a steady, unchanging hand, painting the hills green, then gold, then covering them with a quiet blanket of white. Life in the small town went on, much as it always had. The bakery still filled the morning air with its warm, comforting scent, and the church bell still called the faithful to service each Sunday. For June, the passing of time was not marked by the calendar, but by the slow and patient mending of her spirit. She rose before the sun each day, her hands finding purpose in the rhythmic work of kneading bread and rolling pie crusts. The impulsive girl who had dreamed of city lights was gone, replaced by a woman who understood the deep value of a warm hearth and a day's honest work. Her laughter was rarer now, but when it came it was genuine, no longer a sound seeking escape but one expressing a moment of simple contentment. She spent her evenings with her worn Bible, the pages becoming a map for a heart that had lost its way and was now determined to find its way back. She prayed not for a grand adventure, but for peace, and for the strength to live with the consequences of her choice. Out on the distant cattle trails, time had moved for Wyatt in a different way. The work was hard and endless, a cycle of dust, sweat, and vast, silent skies. The initial sharp pain of rejection had, over many months, faded into a dull, constant ache, and then finally into a scar. He had spoken less and prayed more, his conversations with God shifting from angry questions to quiet pleas for understanding, and finally to a resigned acceptance. The dream of the cabin and a life with June was packed away in a corner of his heart, a beautiful but painful memory he had learned to live alongside. When a letter arrived with news that a buyer was interested in his plot of land and the empty cabin, he saw it as a sign. It was time to go back, to finally cut the last tie to that old dream, sell the land, and use the money to start fresh somewhere entirely new, unburdened by the ghosts of what might have been. His return to the town was under a gray, drizzling sky that seemed to mute the world. He rode down the main street, a stranger in a place that was once his home. He was broader in the shoulder, his face more weathered, and his eyes held a new depth, a stillness born from solitude and reflection. He avoided the looks of old acquaintances, his sole purpose a practical one: meet the buyer, sign the papers, and leave. But as he tied his horse to the post, the one place he found himself standing before was the bakery. It was an impulse he couldn't explain, a pull on a heartstring he thought had long gone slack. He needed a loaf of bread for his journey, he told himself, a simple, practical reason for stepping into the place that held his most painful memory. The bell above the bakery door jingled, a sound so familiar it was like an echo from another life. June was behind the counter, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. When she looked up, her entire world seemed to stop. The color drained from her face, then rushed back in a warm flush. There he was, not as a memory but as a solid, real man, filling the doorway with his presence. The air in the small shop grew thick and heavy, charged with all the words that had been left unsaid for so long. "Wyatt," she finally breathed, his name a whisper that held a universe of regret and wonder. He removed his hat, his own movements slow and deliberate. "June?" He nodded, his voice deeper than she remembered. He placed his order for a simple loaf, his words polite but distant, as if speaking to a shopkeeper he had never met. But as she wrapped the bread in brown paper, her hands trembled so visibly she nearly dropped it. It was this small, unguarded moment that broke through his carefully built walls. Seeing her so shaken, the proud, bright girl now humbled and nervous, stirred something in him that was not anger but a deep, aching compassion. "I was wrong, Wyatt," she said, her voice low and earnest, her eyes fixed on his, begging him to listen. "I was so foolish and selfish. I thought I wanted noise and excitement, but all I found was loneliness. The adventure I was looking for. I see now it wasn't out there. It was right here." She spoke not with the dramatic flair of her youth, but with the quiet conviction of someone who had learned a hard truth. She told him of her prayers, of her search for forgiveness from God, and of her hope that he might one day find it in his heart to forgive her too. Wyatt listened, his expression unreadable. The part of him that had built up defenses over a year of hurt warned him to take his bread and leave. But the larger part of him, the part that had never truly stopped loving her, saw the genuine change in her eyes. This was not the girl who had rejected him. This was a woman who understood the cost of her choices. He did not give her an answer that day. Instead, he simply nodded, a slow, thoughtful gesture, paid for his bread and left the shop. But he did not ride out of town. He went to the boarding house and took a room, canceling his meeting with the land buyer with a vague excuse. What followed was a slow and careful dance of two wounded hearts learning to trust again. They did not rush. Their first conversations were in the public space of the churchyard after Sunday service, speaking of harmless things. The weather, the health of their families, the sermon they had just heard. Their shared faith became the neutral ground where they could meet, a common language that did not require them to speak of the painful past. They spoke of God's grace and the promise of new beginnings, finding solace in the familiar hymns and prayers. Slowly, cautiously, they began to take walks together along the creek path, the babbling water filling the silences between their slowly deepening conversations. Months passed in this gentle rhythm. The harsh lines of hurt on Wyatt's face began to soften. The constant shadow of regret in June's eyes began to lift, replaced by a tentative, hopeful light. He saw that her dream was no longer for a life away from him, but for a life built with him. One afternoon he took her for a walk, not along their usual path by the creek, but down the overgrown lane that led to his land. The cabin was just as he had left it, strong and silent, but the garden was a tangle of weeds and a layer of dust coated the windows. He led her inside, the empty rooms echoing their footsteps. "I couldn't sell it," he said, his voice quiet in the stillness. He turned to her, his gaze steady and sure. "My heart was always here, June. It never left this place and it never stopped being yours." This time there was no fear in her eyes, only a profound and overflowing love. He asked her again, not as a boy full of frantic hope, but as a man offering a shared future, a partnership built on the solid rock of faith, forgiveness, and a love that had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger. This time, when June said yes, it was a vow as solemn as any they would later make at the altar, a promise sealed not just with a kiss, but with the hard-won tears of a second chance. Their wedding in the little country church was a quiet, joyful affair, a celebration not just of love, but of redemption, a testament to the belief that even the most broken of roads could, with faith and patience, lead back home. The life that grew within the walls of the little log cabin was not one of grand excitement or far-off adventures, but something far deeper and more satisfying. It was a life built deliberately day by day like the careful laying of bricks. Wyatt and June, now husband and wife, rose with the sun. His work was out under the wide sky, tending to the small herd of cattle and the few horses that now dotted their land. Her work was within the home, filling it with the smell of baking bread and the gentle hum of contentment. Together they cleared the land around the cabin and June planted a garden. It was not just any garden. It was a vibrant tapestry of color, with flowers of every hue blooming in neat rows, a testament to the beauty she had learned to cultivate right where she was planted. In the evenings they would sit on the porch he had built, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, their hands linked, their prayers of thanks spoken softly into the twilight. The hollow echo of the past was completely filled with the solid, present joy of their shared purpose. The change, when it came, was as subtle as the first green shoot breaking through the dark soil in spring. It was a new kind of tiredness for June, a feeling that rest would not easily fix. It was a new light in her eyes, a secret, quiet joy that she held close for a few weeks before sharing it with Wyatt. She chose a moment when they were sitting by the large hearth, the fire crackling warmly, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the home he had built for her. She took his work-roughened hand in hers and placed it gently on her apron. Her smile was soft, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears of pure happiness. "Wyatt," she whispered, "our family is growing." The understanding that dawned on his face was a beautiful thing to behold. It was a look of awe, of profound wonder, and of a love so fierce it seemed to fill the entire room. From that day forward, his care for her became even more tender, his prayers even more full of grateful praise for the blessing they had been given. As the months passed and June's form gently rounded, the cabin itself seemed to prepare for the new arrival. Wyatt, in the golden hours of the afternoon after his chores were done, set up his tools in the main room. From seasoned pieces of oak he had been saving, he began to build a crib. It was not a rush job. Each piece of wood was measured, planed, and sanded with a painstaking care that spoke of his deep love for the child who would one day sleep within it. The rhythmic sound of his sanding back and forth, became the soundtrack to June's days as she sat nearby, sewing tiny gowns and blankets from soft, warm flannel. The nursery corner, once a storage space, was transformed into a place of hope and anticipation, a physical promise of the future. They spoke of names, and after much discussion, they decided if the child was a boy, he would be called Caleb, a strong, faithful name from the good book, meaning devoted. The night the baby decided to come was a night of howling wind and lashing rain, as if the whole world was being shaken awake. The journey to fetch the midwife was a treacherous one for Wyatt, but he rode through the storm with a determined heart, his prayers a constant, silent plea for safety. Back in the cabin the hours stretched long and thin. For June, it was a trial of pain and endurance, a journey into a valley where she had to cling to her faith with all her strength. For Wyatt, waiting in the main room, his own strength was found on his knees, his head bowed, entrusting his wife and unborn child to God's care. Then, cutting through the sound of the storm and the tension, came a new sound, a strong, healthy cry that seemed to silence everything else. The midwife, her face weary but beaming, emerged and placed a tightly swaddled bundle in June's arms. "A fine, strong son," she said. Wyatt moved to the bedside, his eyes overflowing with an emotion too vast for words. He looked down at his wife, her face pale but radiant, and then at the tiny, perfect face of his son. The baby, Caleb, had a dusting of fair hair and eyes that seemed to already hold a deep knowing. As June held their son, and Wyatt wrapped his strong arms around them both, creating a circle of safety and love, June leaned her head against his shoulder. "This is the song I was always meant to find," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It wasn't in a concert hall. It was right here with you." In that moment, the last fragment of her old, restless dream finally dissolved, replaced by the profound and complete melody of a family founded on faith. The years that followed were a beautiful, unfolding story, a harvest from the seeds of forgiveness and commitment they had sown so long ago. The cabin was no longer quiet, but filled with the happy sounds of a growing boy. Caleb, now a lively 5-year-old with his father's steady gaze and his mother's bright curiosity, was a constant source of joy. He followed Wyatt everywhere, a tiny shadow in his own pair of sturdy overalls, helping to feed the chickens and gather the eggs. One warm afternoon, as Wyatt lifted the boy onto the back of a gentle old plow horse, June watched them from the porch. Her hand rested softly on her rounding belly, for a new life was growing within her once again, another blessing to fill their home with love. She looked out at her husband and her son, at the vibrant garden and the strong cabin, and she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that this was the forever after she had almost lost. It was a forever built not on easy promises, but on a love that had been tested by fire, strengthened by faith, and would endure for all their days. If this story of a love redeemed through patience and faith has touched your heart, consider joining our community for more tales that celebrate the enduring values of commitment, family, and hope. Subscribe to our channel to be notified when our next story begins. Your support helps us continue to share these important lessons. May your own journey be filled with such blessings.